This is the first in a series of lessons that deals with physician practice operations. And in particular, we're dealing with how a physician practice generates revenue, the associated expenses that the practice will incur to produce that revenue, and then ultimately how a practice generates earnings, which in the case of many practices, that those earnings become the physician's income or compensation. And as with most subjects, it's helpful to start with a simplified kind of basic model. For this lesson, we're going to be looking at a family practice physician in an outpatient setting. And once we kind of get the vocabulary down for how it is a physician practice operates, we'll in subsequent lessons be able to build into more complicated practice structures. But it will be helpful if we start with the same foundation, we formalize some of the vocabulary that will be used, and we define some of the concepts to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. So I'm calling this lesson the basic building blocks of physician practice operations. And as mentioned, probably the most simplified model to start with is this family practice outpatient model. So maybe imagine for a second that you're a brand new family practice physician. You've just finished medical school, you've gone through your residency, you're board certified, and now you're ready to open a practice. We're going to assume further that this is going to be a solo physician practice. So this is a one physician practice. This physician is willing to take on the prospect of opening up a brand new practice in a brand new area. The first thing a physician might likely do is go out and procure some office space, which will be represented by this box that I've drawn. And it might be something like 2,500 square feet of office space. And we've all been inside physician practices before. Let's say this is the door. The office space might be divided into a waiting area. Behind that might be the receptionist desk. And there might be an area set aside for maybe just what we'll call it general office space, and this might be where patient records are stored, medical supplies. The office manager might work from there doing some of the claims processing, and then the office might be further divided into exam rooms. And let's just say that this particular office space has 4 exam rooms. And again, we're assuming a solo practice family physician in this case. So that's really how the physical space might be laid out. And then, of course, the physician needs to outfit that space with various kinds of equipment. So let's say that each exam room might have an exam table or chair. Also might have a workstation. This might be a computer or something similar where the physician can access the patient's records and other things that he needs to do his work. In the office space, there might be a couple more computer terminals. There might be some shelving where different things are stored, some cabinets for the medical supplies and other things. The receptionist, of course, will have a computer and maybe a phone. And then the waiting area, might have a bunch of chairs, of course, a table with a TV on it. And there may be other things in the practice, but the idea is there's a certain amount of equipment and supplies that the physician will need to purchase to fill that office space. And then finally, the physician will need to employ some people to help him or her go about their work. And we've mentioned one of those. The physician will likely have a receptionist. The physician may also have a nurse or a physician's assistant, and this is the person that helps facilitate the patients through the process, might do some of the more basic routine screening and tests on the patient in preparation for the physician to come in and take care of that patient. There may be an office manager This person would be, responsible for helping to do the bookkeeping, do some of the claims processing, perhaps, order supplies and other things. But this then really becomes the infrastructure that a physician would put in place to go about practicing medicine. And in the business world, we call this overhead. So these are the expenses that the practice will incur. And I've already kind of grouped them into three main categories. And the first is space. So this is the physical space that the physician occupies to do his or her work. Second would be the equipment and supplies needed for the physician to do their work. And third are the staff. So these are the people that the physician needs to employ. And there are other components of overhead, but relative to these three broad categories, they're relatively minor. And so physician practices generally focus on these three areas. And you may notice right away that this is a relatively large fixed cost investment for the physician. And we'll get into overhead in more detail in subsequent lessons, but the point here being one of the challenges of managing a physician practice is that overhead is mostly fixed. In a lot of businesses, you can ramp up your overhead, ramp it up or down based on the volume of whatever it is that your company might be producing. But in the case of the physician, the overhead structure is relatively fixed, and it's a relatively high cost. Now, against all of this overhead, the physician hopes to generate revenue, and hopefully generate enough revenue that the physician not only covers overhead, but generates a substantial amount beyond that, which becomes then their earnings or their income. And we've all been in physician practices. We kind of know the routine. The revenue side begins with the patient. So the patient comes into the office. The patient might go and see the receptionist and provide their insurance card and fill out some paperwork, and then go sit down and wait for a few minutes until the nurse or the physician assistant comes and calls the patient back into one of the exam rooms. And there, the patient may have some preliminary testing done, vital signs and other things in preparation for the physician. The physician comes in, might spend 10 or 15 minutes with the patient, prescribe some kind of treatment plan. In this case, we'll just assume this is a fairly routine office visit, after which the patient leaves the room, might stop and talk to the receptionist and schedule a follow-up appointment, and then leaves the office. And that's what we call a patient encounter. So this is a patient coming into a practice, and of course there's a certain amount of revenue associated with that patient. Either the patient themselves, or in most cases the insurance company, will pay the physician practice for that service provided. And so you can imagine that that was one patient. You can imagine that over a period of time, let's look at this maybe on the course of a day. There might be 20 or 30 patients that are coming and going throughout this practice. And in fact, if we just keep on drawing these lines and eventually look at a week, and then look at months and look at years, there's this constant flow of patients coming in and out of the physician practice. And it's the compilation or the summation of all of those patient encounters that eventually results in the practice revenue. And I'll go ahead and write that word, the practice revenue, that will offset the overhead. And so now I'm briefly going to go through the main components of revenue and how it is when someone talks about maximizing revenue in a physician practice, what are the variables or the levers that the practice manager or the physician has to enhance revenue? And the first one should be fairly obvious, right? It's volume. Sometimes we call it productivity, but this is simply the number of patients that comes through the practice. And generally speaking, the more patients that come through the practice, the more revenue the practice will be able to generate. Second, and closely related to volume, is what we call utilization. And this deals with the number of things that a physician does per patient. So you can imagine two practices. Imagine one that's just a super simplified model where patients are just coming in for routine exams and checkups with the physician, and there really isn't a whole lot of other services that practice provides or needs that the patients have. And contrast that with another practice where perhaps the physician is a little more specialized or offers more services. Perhaps they put casts on broken arms, in which case they of course need the casting equipment. They also need to maybe perform x-rays and other things. Or a physician office that does a lot of lab tests, takes blood and urine samples. So all that falls under utilization, which is the number of things done per patient. And again, generally speaking, the more things you do per patient in the physician practice, the more revenue that will be generated. The third component of revenue is what we call coding. Another word is documentation. After the physician sees the patient, the physician fills out some paperwork that documents the services provided to the patient. And at the end of that document, the physician selects a code. It's a 5-digit code. It's universal throughout the health industry. And we'll spend a lot of time on these codes in subsequent lessons. But the idea being the physician selects a 5-digit code, and that code defines or identifies what the physician did to the patient. And that code eventually is what is sent on to the insurance companies and how the physician gets paid. And in fact, that is the next component, which is what we call payer rates. And these are the rates that the physician gets paid per service the physician provides. So of course this is based on those codes that I mentioned. So Blue Cross Blue Shield, when it sees code XXXXX, a 5-digit code, it is contracted with the physician to pay them a certain amount for that code. Likewise, Medicare will also have contracted a different amount, perhaps more, perhaps less than another payer, to pay for that same service. And related to payer rates is what we call payer mix. And payer mix deals with the composition or the numbers of patients coming into the practice that are represented by each insurance company. So, for example, if I look at all the patients over a given year, I might see that 25% of all my patients have Medicare as their primary insurance. Another 15% have Blue Cross Blue Shield. And of course the implication there is that since I'm paid different rates, I have different contracted rates by different payers, if I can manage my payer mix to where I'm seeing more patients who are represented by insurance companies who pay me more per service, the practice will, in general, again, be able to generate more revenue. And the final component of revenue is, it has various names, but here we'll call it revenue cycle. And this is the process of actually then collecting the revenue that the physician has documented and the services that the physician has performed. So this is the process of submitting claims to insurance companies and receiving and posting the payments. And we'll get into each of these in a lot more detail in subsequent lessons, but the purpose of this lesson is to identify all of those variables that are at play in a physician practice. So this is how the physician generates revenue, the expenses that they incur against that revenue, and the resulting overhead, or the resulting what we call earnings, right? So revenue less overhead equals the practice earnings. And as mentioned earlier, sometimes these earnings are paid out. That's the physician's compensation. In other settings, so for example, a large physician group, a portion of that may be paid out to the physicians as compensation, and another piece may be retained to expand the practice. In an employed group, there may be other ways to deal with those earnings, but these are the basic building blocks for how a physician practice generates its earnings and its income. And we'll in subsequent lessons get into each of these in a lot more detail, and then once we have that whole framework in place, we'll be able to apply this then to some of the more unique aspects of different practice models.